Okay, now it looks like I'm live. I just turned on my microphone. I'm going to wait a few minutes for people to join the conversation, and hopefully somebody can tell me if uh, if you can hear me. Oh, I know what's happening. It probably has to wait for a few minutes. I said 7 p.m. and it is now it's 7 p.m. Okay. Hey, Marty, I can see and hear you. Okay. Thanks, Byron. All right. Appreciate that. You're the first person to join. Welcome tonight. I'm maybe I'm from Alberta. Where are you from, Byron? Edmonton. Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to start talking because this is being recorded and people can watch it after the fact. So I hope that if you're watching live or if you're watching after the fact, that you appreciate the video that I did recently. I went to Hey, Lost Without You. Nice to join us. Thank you. Or nice that you could join us. So last week, about 2 weeks ago, I went on two hikes, as a matter of fact. So I left on the 9th of June. So 9, 10, 11, I went up the Klein River to do a little bit of scoping out, because this summer I hope to do a very long trip in the Klein Ghost or White Goat area. So got a 10-day trip planned in there. So we went into the Klein quickly to see what Coral Creek looked like. Then I came out of there on the 11th. And since I was already, halfway up the Canadian Rockies around the Saskatchewan crossing area, and then I had that subsequent trip up Maligne Pass planned with Wally, rather than come home, I started out on the Maligne Trail, headed up to Pobocton, and then Wally caught up with me. So, and of the two hikes that I did a couple of weeks ago, the first one that I published was the Maligne Lake hike, because I thought that was kind of the more important hike that people would be more interested in. So let me tell you a little bit of history about the Maligne Pass. Um, Maligne Pass is leads to Maligne Lake. So if you think back about the 1900s, like in the very early 1900s, when there was no highway, if you were a Canadian, if you were visiting the Rockies from somewhere in the early 1900s, you could get to Banff by rail. But then if you wanted to go to up to Lake Louise or up to Jasper, you had to get on horseback with some of the outfitters. Brewster was a famous outfitter, still around today, but of those days, and he would take people on hikes. And a famous explorer or socialite in those days was a lady by the name of Mary Schaefer. And Mary Schaefer was an American who loved to come here. She had money and she'd come to the Rockies every year, and she'd go, spend 3-4 months here. She had lots of money. She'd hire the best outfitters and she'd go traveling through the Canadian Rockies. And things are named after her. And Mary Schaefer had heard of this great lake, which we know today as Maligne Lake. She had heard about this lake, but and she had attempted to get to that lake, and I think around 1905, 1906, and she didn't, with an outfitter, and she didn't reach the lake. And in 1907, she met a Stoney Indian. So the Stoney Nation is a nation just west of Calgary, around the Morley area. Between Calgary and Canmore is the Morley Nation. And there was a Stoney Indian in there by the name of Samson Beaver. And he met Mary Schaefer. And Samson, he had been to modern day Maligne Lake years and years earlier, like near the end of the 1800s. He had been there with his father. And he drew on a map where this lake was, and he gave it to Mary Schaefer. And Mary Schaefer, with her guides and her outfitters in 1908, went up what today we call the Great Divide Trail, and she ended up finding Maligne Lake and naming it Maligne Lake. Now, technically, she wasn't the first European to see that lake. Somebody by the name of Henry McLeod, who was a surveyor for the Canadian Pacific Railroad, he had seen the lake from a higher summit at one point while he was trying to trace out a path for the Canadian Pacific Railroad. So he saw it first, but we credit Mary Schaefer with being the first European or North American or what non-native person to see the lake and name it. And when you go to the lake today, prominently from the Maligne Lake boat launch, you can see Samson Peak and you can see Leah. So Samson Beaver and Leah Beaver, his wife, those two peaks there are named after Samson Beaver, from the Stoney Nation. Now, so I did that hike. Now, so Maligne Pass is not a very important. It's an important pass. So if you think back before the Columbia ice field was built in the 1950s or 40s, to travel up to between, say, Banff and Lake Louise and Jasper, you followed what we today call the Great Divide Trail. So you would leave from Banff, and you would go up, follow Pipestone Creek to its headwaters, and then you would come down the Siffler, and then from the Siffler you would go across at Saskatchewan Crossing, and then you would follow the modern day road, and then you would go up Maligne Pass, over Maligne Pass, and then over this another pass, and you would end up in Jasper. So it was a very important route for tourists, but prior to that, it had been an important route for fur traders. Now, and if you're familiar with the mountains, if you look at the Canadian Rockies, they're formed because the Pacific Plate and the Continental Plate got together and pushed up the mountains. And basically, the Canadian Rockies run north and south, almost as a continuous line. But and so they run north and south as a continuous line, but they run in sort of parallel lines. So you got the main range, like the Queen Elizabeth Range, and then you got smaller ranges like the Panther Range. So traveling north to south along the Canadian Rockies in several areas is quite easy. So this this trail that I just described, the Maligne Trail, the Pipestone Pass, that's sort of an easy north-south trail. It's gorgeous, and it's gorgeous, and it's kind of easy to hike. Now, when they chose to put the highway, they put it one valley west of there, and through the Columbia ice field, because it was more scenic for roads and had easier construction. There was all sorts of issues why they picked that, but there were several important north-south corridors in the Rockies, and so Maligne Pass is an important north-south corridor. Now, another fact about the Rockies is that going east to west, they're hard to traverse because there's not a lot of passes. And so north-south corridors are important, and there's a couple of important east to west corridors that lead to passes. So when we talk about important passes in the Rockies, from north to south, you got Yellowhead Pass, Athabasca Pass, House Pass, Kicking Horse, all the way down to down in Pincher Creek. I forgot. I'm having a memory blank. But anyways, now, so these passes were important, and these passes ended up becoming trails over the years. So for people that love to hike in the Rockies, you're basically hiking on old historic trails almost always. Well, no, not almost always. You're always hiking on Crow's Nest. Thank you, whoever said that. I was drawing it there. All I know is there's 7 passes going across. And Athabasca is gorgeous. If you can go to Athabasca, go visit it. House, and not so much. But anyway, so over the years, the parks were established, and the trails were sort of maintained, and people used the trails. And all the trails that we use, whether it's the Skyline or whether it's the Pobocton or the Brazos, they're all historic trails that were used by First Nations hundreds and hundreds of years. And then they were used by fur traders, and then in recent time they were used by hikers. Now, and there was I call it sort of a golden era of backpacking. In the 70s and the 80s, backpacking became popular, and Parks Canada put a lot of effort to install infrastructure on all the trails that we use. So they started installing little campsites and rustic picnic tables and bear poles and latrines and stuff like that. And then in the 90s, the popularity went down. And I think we're kind of well, actually, in the 70s and 80s, it was the first golden era of hiking. That's the era of when old external frame backpacks and old gear. Then in the 90s, there was another era. So when I started hiking in the 90s, when I was in my 20s, I call that sort of the second popular era of backpacking. And then it went down at the end of the 90s. And then in the 2005, 6, and recently, there's been an explosion in the popularity of hiking. Now, all along, Parks Canada, Yellow Boy 1866, hi from New Zealand. Thanks for joining us. Hope you can make it to Canada someday. I'm just giving a quick history lesson on how the trails came about. So in the mid 90s, after that second wave of popularity dissipated, Parks Canada started decommissioning trails, and one of the trails they decommissioned was Maligne Pass. For one big important reason. Well, two reasons. One is it wasn't used very often. So as you can, and one reason Maligne Pass is not used very often, as you could see from the video that I just did, is that logistically it's very complicated, because you either start at Pobocton, or if you're crazy, you can start further back at Nigel Pass. And then you can do, Nigel Pass, Jonas, Pobocton, and then follow Pobocton Creek and go over Maligne Pass, and then you end up at Maligne Lake. But Maligne Lake is 40 kilometers from Jasper, and then you have to come down the Icefields Parkway. So one way or another, the two trailheads, even though Maligne Pass is about a 45 kilometer hike, you end up with about 120 kilometer car drive from one trailhead to the other. So it fell out of popularity in the 1990s. And Parks Canada made the decision to decommission it for that reason. But the second reason Parks Canada decommissioned Maligne Pass in the 1990s was it's a low pass. It's a beautiful open valley, if you saw the video, but it is prime caribou habitat and grizzly habitat. So the idea that Parks Canada had was to decommission this unpopular trail. And by decommissioning, for Parks Canada, decommissioning means they weren't going to maintain the campsites or the bridges and stuff like that. And so they decommissioned it in an effort to let it go wild again and promote it as an environment for the caribou and the grizzlies. Now, I hiked Maligne Pass in the era when it was decommissioned. So back in, say, early 2000, when you wanted to hike Maligne Pass, all you had to do was call Parks Canada and get what we call the bivouac permit. They considered that a random area. And it wasn't a big problem because very few people random camped in there. And we knew back in 2000 that all these old decommissioned campsites were still usable, and the trail was overgrown, but it was okay. But recently, in the last couple of years, the trail has gained a lot of popularity because of the Great Divide Trail. So Maligne Pass is smack dab in the middle of Section E of the Great Divide Trail. So Section E starts at Saskatchewan Crossing and ends at Jasper. So Section E is what I just described. You start at Saskatchewan Crossing, you do Owen Creek, over Michelle Lake, down to Pinto Lake, up Cataract Pass, over Nigel, to Boulder, across Jonas, down a little bit, Maligne Pass, out to Maligne Lake, and over the skyline. So that's Section E. So everybody's so Maligne Pass has become popular again because closed off because of all the Bigfoots you keep hearing about. Quite possibly. So Maligne Pass all of a sudden became re-popular. And what happened is 3-4 years ago, Parks Canada realized that they were getting requests for random camping in the area. And so Parks Canada did a bit of a compromise. They quote unquote recommissioned the campsites, meaning you could reserve the campsites. That gave them control of who was where, but they put a very big limitation on those campsites. And so there's 4 campsites along Maligne Pass. There's the most southerly one is Avalanche, which is gorgeous. Then there's Mary Vaux, named after another famous American naturalist who used to come here all the time. Then there's Mary Schaefer. And then after that, there's Trapper Creek. So the 4 campsites, and well, there's a few in between, but Those 4 campsites have been recommissioned by Parks Canada. So they went and put new signage in there and cleaned them up a little bit. And then they're available for reservation on their website. But they put one big giant restriction. Only one group per night can reserve any of those campsites or each of those campsites. So there can be 4 groups in the valley, and each group has to be, together, and it can be a group of 6 people. So it's causing a bit of problem for the people who want to hike the Great Divide, but it's a good compromise because deep down, Parks Canada still wants to keep that trail fairly unpopular and decommissioned to promote caribou and grizzly habitat. So what happens now is when somebody manages to reserve one of those spots on for their Great Divide through hike, everybody else tries to find out who has the spot and then join in on the evenings and share the campsite with that group. But I have a feeling this might backfire, and over time, Parks Canada might put back some serious restrictions on that section. So that's the history of Maligne Pass, and that's why the travel on there is restricted. Now, the reason I wanted to go there recently is I got the offer by Wally to join him on that hike. Wally had attempted to do the Great Divide as a single shot through hike, and then he got injured. So now Wally's going back and doing individual sections. I think he will reattempt it as a whole later on, but he wanted to do this section because he had never done it, and he asked me if I'd join him, so I did. And the interesting thing is that pass is fairly low by Canadian Rocky standards. So that pass is only at 2,200 meters or 2,230, which normally would mean that it's not snowbound very late. But historically, no matter what, even though it's a low elevation pass, because of its orientation and where it's situated, that pass is often snowbound very, very late. And GDT through hikers historically don't start their through hikes until about July. They start at Waterton in July and then they get going. So by going there this past week, I'm able to at least provide some intel to through hikers, letting them know that you're not going to have any issues whatsoever hiking Maligne Pass. In fact, I'd encourage people, go visit Maligne Pass. It's gorgeous. But you saw sort of my reaction. I don't think you need to go, the best part of the pass is the pass itself. So if you start at Sunwapta Warden Station along Highway 93 and you hike into Pobocton and then over Pobocton Camp and then over to Avalanche Camp, you get quickly to the pass within, 17, 18 kilometers. So my advice to people is go base camp at Avalanche and go visit the pass as a day hike. Because once you're over the pass and you go down towards Maligne Lake, you immediately enter the forest and it is absolutely uneventful. So there's really nothing fancy about this trail. That's why it was decommissioned and not popular. But it is a worthy objective for a day or two to go to Avalanche and go visit the pass. I totally encourage people to do that. So just looking at a couple of things I wanted to talk about. Couple of things that were interesting that happened while I was on the trail. The first one was on day 2, there was a porcupine on the trail. And if you heard me talking about the porcupine, as soon as I saw the porcupine on the trail, I said, my nemesis. Well, if you've been following me for years, you would know that for me, I often get asked the question of what are the am I scared of bears? And obviously the answer is no. Well, I have a healthy respect for bears, but I'm not scared of bears. I think I understand bear behavior enough, and I have I've been doing this long enough. But when people ask me the animal that scares me the most on the trail, they're often surprised because the answer comes so easily to me, and it's porcupines. And that's why I call the porcupine my nemesis. I have had more encounters that have turned into a negative outcome with porcupines than anything else. I mean, to be honest, I meet bears on the trail probably every 3rd day on the hike. So if I go on a 10-day hike, I'll see bears 2-3 times. So generally speaking, every 3rd day that I hike, I encounter bears. And of all the sort of big bear encounters that I've had over the years where they've either come in my camp or bluffed me or did something like that. I've never had an outcome that was really negative. They've always turned out good. I mean, my worst outcome with a bear was the one that circled my camp at Lake of the Horns a couple of years ago, and he circled, a few times, and he was extremely curious, and he made me extremely uncomfortable, but he eventually left without incident. But I can't say the same thing about porcupines. I've had porcupines that come into my camp, even when I'm there. Even on this trip, after I saw the porcupine, he took off into the trees. I basically passed him. I got to the junction where I waited for Wally, and he came right into the junction. He came right up to me, and he walked right past me. He didn't care about me. And I've had I've had incidents with porcupines where they come into my camp. They've gone under my awning. Even when I'm in the tent, they've grabbed my backpack. They've chewed on my backpack. They've chewed on my pole, on my boots. They've chewed on tires in the parking lot. They've stolen food. They're persistent. They're very fearless, I'd say. And then of my 4 dogs, 3 of my dogs have had encounters with porcupines on the trail over the years, which is a huge problem. So I don't like porcupines, and that's why I say porcupines are my nemesis. Now, hopefully when Wally publishes his video of this hike, you'll see up close. He took some close up of the porcupines. Somebody's asking if there were any wildlife in the Maligne Pass area, any mountain goats to photograph. As I said, it's an area famous for its caribou and its grizzly. We stopped at the pass proper and scanned it for an hour solid and never saw any animals. So I think the animals right now, it's so warm in the mountains and there's so many mosquitoes that the animals are going back up into higher elevations and avoiding the valleys. So the animals are at higher elevation right now. And as far as Maligne Pass for an area where I would see mountain goats, no, that's not an area where I would expect to see a lot of mountain goats. If you want to see mountain goats, Wilmore Wilderness is fantastic for mountain goats. It's a topic for another discussion. I mean, last year we had a great encounter with mountain goats. It was fantastic. I saw so many mountain goats in Wilmore. And another place where I've seen lots of mountain goats is down south by Molar Pass. So if you go over Molar Pass and you go to Fish Lake, right behind Fish Lake, there's a mountain that's got a huge cliff. And I can almost guarantee you that if you go to Fish Lake and you glass that cliff, you will see mountain goats. I'm reading a couple of comments here just to see, can those prickly things flick the spines out? No, they can't. So porcupines do not flick or throw their quills. It's a great question. It's a common myth. They don't throw them, but they are extremely loosely attached. So what a quill is basically it's a hair that's been, that's kind of modified. And on the end of the hair, actually, I have some here. Jeez. Sorry for turning away from. I had a. Sorry, I have a jar somewhere with porcupine quills, but porcupine quills are long hairs with a barb on the end, and all you have to do is barely touch. So if the tips of the quills are like hypodermic needles, are extremely sharp, and barely touching them, and they will get embedded in your hand or whatever, and then when you pull your hand, they'll pull out. So they don't throw them, but they're very easily dislodged. And if somebody asks a follow-up question, if you do have an animal that has porcupine quills, there's a common theory that says you leave them in. Do not do that. If your dog gets porcupine and you can pull them out, you have to pull them out. And your animal is going to be in distress. One of the tricks, if you have a dog or a larger dog, is to grab like a pair of pants or a towel or something and wrap it around that dog and literally confine that dog and then pull the quills out. You have to pull them out. Now, if there's some in their mouth or in places where you can't reach them, then those will have to be pulled out by a vet. And no matter what, if your animal gets quilled, There's a chance of rabies, and there's a big chance of infection. And even if you think you've got all the quills out, take your animal to the vet, because they'll do a quick x-ray, see if there are quills, because they can get them in places where you won't quite see them, like in their nose and whatnot. And then an easy trick for pulling them out is you cut them. They're kind of like straws, and they're hollow on the inside. And if you cut them, you can squeeze them and then pull them out more easily. Hopefully you never have to do that. But I'm reading the comments. I hear that moose are dangerous. Hey, any animal is large is dangerous. So that's something we see commonly. We see tourists on the side of the road approaching quick, whether it's a moose or a bear or an elk or even a goat or a sheep can be dangerous. So my advice is, don't approach animals. Lake of the Falls, I've seen mountain goats up close last year, the weekend, September, about 10 feet away as we were hiking the peak. Awesome. Okay, that would make sense, actually. Lake of the Falls is a gorgeous lake with that sort of that cliff. So that's where mountain goats love to be, is on those cliffs. And just a word of advice or a little trick. Sometimes when you're sitting at a lake, whether it's Lake of the Falls or Lake of the Horns or Carnarvon Lake, and then you hear a rock slide, and people immediately turn and see a rock slide, and then they're looking for something like an avalanche or something big. Well, commonly, goats that are walking along or sheep will trigger a small rock slide. So if you have a small rock slide, keep an eye out and look, because that's where you might see goats or other animals. Now I'm just going down. So I talked about porcupines. Now I want to talk about another topic that's not popular, and that's hitchhiking. So you saw on that trip that when I was, hey Brody, thanks for joining us. Happy you could join us. I'm reading a couple of comments here. So you saw on that trip that when I was done, I hitchhiked, and I see lots of comments about people asking, looking for rides or trying to figure out ways to get between two trailheads. And ideally, if you're two people, you can go drop off a vehicle at the end and one to have at the start, and then that solves the problem. Another interesting thing is you can have a group start at one end and another group start at the other end, and as you cross each other on the trail, you can exchange keys and re-meet later. But I'll those are options. Another option that's really fantastic a lot of times is if the two trailheads aren't too far apart, let's say Fried Valley and Geraldine Lake, you can connect them by bicycle. So maybe instead of driving between the two, you can ride your bike from one to the other, things like that. But I'll be honest, I hitchhike often. Almost every year, at least once a year, I have an opportunity where I have to hitchhike. So either it's on purpose because I'm hiking solo and at the other end, my vehicle wasn't there, or once in a while it's because I've had to exit somewhere unexpectedly. And then I come out where I didn't expect to come out, because that can happen. You can park a car at one end and at the other, but something happens and then you're coming out somewhere different. So I hitchhike frequently. And I always make the comment that first of all, I guess maybe I'm not call me a hopeless optimist, but I do believe and I have faith in humanity, and I do think people are pretty good. So I'm not afraid of hiking. And I also think that, in when you're in a national park, like I'm at Maligne Lake and I'm hitchhiking, the people that are there for a reason. They're tourists, and I'm there for a reason. I'm a tourist. And so I think I'm pretty obvious when I'm standing on the side of the road that I am a tourist, or not a tourist, that I'm backpacking. Now, that said, I make little tricks for hiking. So for hitchhiking. So if I know I'm going to hitchhike, I have little signs that I carry in my backpack that, that I've made over the years that are laminated, and I'll write something catchy on my sign. I'll write something, I've made it to the top. Now I just need to get back to my car. Or if you know where you're going. So if you're at Jasper and you're hitchhiking because you need to go back to Lake Louise or Saskatchewan Crossing, if you have a sign that says Saskatchewan Crossing 40 kilometers, you give some information, let people know what you're trying to achieve, then they're more likely to stop. The other thing that helps is if you're at a place like I was at Maligne Lake, you can walk into among the parking lot, and go introduce yourself to people and say, hey folks, um, could I bother you for a ride back to Jasper? I just finished hiking. So, I might get negative comments on this, but I always say to people, don't underestimate the importance, the hitchhiking as a tool in your arsenal while backpacking. Now, that said, when you see the video, I made a comment, and my comment is 100% legitimate. Almost, 9 times out of 10, when I get picked up when I'm hitchhiking, it's tourists. And I mean, when I say tourists, I mean tourists from like out of country. So on this trip, I got picked up by a wonderful young couple from the Netherlands. And so they brought me from Maligne Lake back to Jasper, and then they were kind enough, once I got in Jasper, I would have walked to the corner of Highway 93 and Highway 16 gladly, but they like, no, we'll drive you right there. It was pouring rain, so I totally appreciated it. And when they dropped me at that corner, I swear, one light change, and all of a sudden the traffic flow changed. And on that first light change, the first car that came in, it felt like that car was getting pushed by a big truck, so he had to keep going. And then I watched the truck go by, and when the truck was done, the little car was stopped there. I was like, wow. And the car that stopped was an older couple from Wisconsin, from Madison, Wisconsin. And I jumped in with them. They were fantastic. They drove me to Sunwapta, and like they were so chill, and they were like literally had a back, they're in their 70s, but they had backpacking experience and everything else. And we had a great conversation. So, it's just a favor to me. Like once in a while, if you see somebody hitchhiking in the Rockies, don't be so scared, stop and offer a ride. You never know. You might end up picking up a guy like Martyupnorth, and Marty will tell you all sorts of really cool stories while we're driving. Let me read. Is this the hike you encountered a lot of rain and had to set up under a tree, and you ever thought of used ultralight tarp to set up under, and why? Yes, this is the hike where I had to set up under a tree. I guess it's a bit, I broke a bit of a rule because I showed up at Pobocton campsite soaking wet, and there's 4 designated campsites, but I didn't use a designated campsite because they're right in the open. And so I found another spot a little bit away from the designated campsite that was under a big old tree where there just wasn't that much rain falling, because a tree can provide a ton of shelter from the rain. And so I set up there. Now, deep down, I knew, it's like, what is it? I was there on a Sunday night, so everybody had already left. I can tell there was no trail, no footsteps on the trail. I can tell when I'm reserving if there's going to be people, because when you're reserving a campsite, you can go look and see how many spots of the campsite have been. So I knew I was going to be alone. I ended up setting up my tent under a tree, and in a situation like that, like I said, I have jokingly saying I'm in pre-survival mode. I mean, when you show up at a spot and you're freezing cold and wet, you have to do a few things. And if Parks Canada came and said you can't do that, I think they'd be understanding that I'd set up a small footprint off to the side underneath the tree. But it is what it is. Now, why do I not bring a tarp? The tarp would be the tarp or the tent is the same thing. I mean, if I was freezing cold and wet, I'd still have to set up the tarp and then put my tent under the tarp, I suppose. But once my tent is set up, I'm already protected. So for me, I've been doing this for so long, I can pretty much set up my tent like in a matter of minutes, pretty quickly, in a way where it won't get as wet as, keep it as dry as possible. And once my tent is set up, I can bring my pack in my tent, unload my gear. And on that circumstance, last week, my sleeping bag was moist, had gotten some moisture in it. But to be honest, once you're in your tent, your mattress is inflated and you're in your sleeping bag, you're in comfort and you're safe. And then I got a stove and water and things like that. So it's not that bad. Now, generally speaking, I've talked about this quite a few times. Everybody has a routine when they get into camp. My routine almost, 90% of the time when I get into camp is set up the tent first. If you set up your tent first and throw your gear on there, no matter what happens after that, you're going to be okay. In winter, sometimes when I get into camp, my routine is to start a fire and go get firewood first. So it changes a little bit from summer to winter, but in the summer, set up camp is quickly. A tarp is only good when you have company, then you can hang out together. Oh, good point, Jacqueline. Very good point. A tarp under the trees when you don't want to retreat to your tent and you want to have a social event in the full rain. Absolutely. And I would say, which brings up another point, the gear I bring when you're with a group, then communal gear is more important than when I'm alone. So when I'm alone, I have less creature comforts and I'm going to spend the night in my tent. Do you know how the taut line hitch? Yeah, I know that. I know a lot of knots. I spent years as a young adult sailing, and I work in the oil patch where we have to also tie down loads to trucks and things like that. In fact, in the oil patch, we call those guys swampers. Daryl, welcome, Daryl. Always enjoy your adventures, Marty. Your wealth of knowledge. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. So I'm almost going to close it, but I want to talk about one last thing, and I got a couple of comments on this, but it's no big deal. So me and Wally left together. Okay, so no, sorry. Me and Wally hiked together, but I went on the trail ahead of him. Like I said, I happened to be in the area, so I hiked up 5 kilometers ahead of him, and I camped at Pabocton. Then I backtracked on the next day, and then waited for Wally, and then he came the next day, and he caught up to me. So then on day 2, we hiked together and ended up at Maryvaux, where he made that absolutely amazing roast, like so amazing. I mean, he wrapped it in parchment paper and then foil. We put it in the fire. We told stories around the camp. He took that roast out of the fire. Like, I'm getting excited thinking about it. Then he took that roast out of the fire, and then he put it in a pan, and then he smothered it in butter with shallots and rosemary and other things. And in his video, you'll see we literally spent 20 to 25 minutes eating. That's how much food it was. But so we hiked together, and then the next day we had planned to hike. The first day was to Maryvaux. The second day was to Mary Schaefer, and then out. Now on that third day, it started raining, and midway through the day, and Wally decided, kind of in his mind, that he didn't need to be out there. For him, like I said, mission accomplished. I mean, going through the pass, and he kind of decided that he was capable of just going all the way out to the Maligne Lake. His car was there, and then he lives in Jasper, so he was just going to go to Jasper. We talked about this on the trail. He didn't abandon me or anything like that. On the trail, he said, are you okay if I keep going? And I'm like, yes, I'm absolutely 100% okay if you keep going. And because I knew, now, sure, it would have been convenient if I'd have kept going, because we could have used this car to get back to town. But then I still had a hitchhike back. His car being at the trailhead only solved one hitchhike problem. I still had a second one. So I said to Wally, go. And when I hike, even when I hike in a group, and I talked about this in a video I did recently, where I did a video on hiking in groups. Almost always when I hike in groups, I still hike as though I'm going to be independent. So I have my own food, my own stove, my own tent, my own gear. It's so seldom that I would hike where I have really communal group, like a tent or a stove. I'll do that with my family. But anything other than my family, even if we're in a group, I hike to be completely 100% independent. And so in that circumstance, when Wally says I'm going ahead, trust me, folks, it's no big deal. Because if it was, I would have said, you stay. Or if it was a big deal, I would have found whatever energy needed to go along with him. But in my mind, me and Wally hike together, we have a slightly different style. So Wally is more of an objective driven, and he saw the pass and then he's done. Now, I've been hiking for so long, and I've been to all these places. So for me, the objective of that hike is not to see the pass. The objective of my hike lately is actually to just be out there in the wilderness and enjoying the solitude and the time away. So when Wally decides he's going on, he's actually kind of doing me a favor, because he leaves me alone to do what I enjoy doing, which is being alone in camp. So that last night when we're alone in camp, you saw there, I made a fire. There is no fire bans. Any people who said there was fire bans, trust me, we had a permit from Parks Canada. The permit clearly stated no fire bans, fires allowed in the fire boxes. So I made a fire on the last night, sat around. Sure, I was short on food a little bit because Wally had planned all the meals, but he left me a snack. I had some snacks. I'm never going to be starving. I got a few pounds on my belly anyways. So Wally continued on. The rain stopped. I got to make a fire, drink a couple of scotches by the fire, and contemplate life. That's it. And then the next day I got on my, now it rained overnight. And then the next day I walked out in the rain, and it's part of the adventure. So don't criticize Wally or anybody else, and vice versa. I had another, I remember the time, maybe some of you remember the hike where Stu Howe came from New Brunswick to hike with me. I think that was in around 2021 or 2020. And me and Stu had this long hike planned through the Clearwater and back down Red Deer Lakes and that part of the world. And Stu got injured on the second day. And, we were only about, 15 kilometers away from the trailhead at that point. We hadn't even reached Molar Pass. And man, I mean, we debated forever, and he needed to go back, and I was going to go back with him. And he kept saying, no, 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 no. And I had a little bit of remorse, but I kept on going. I had to change my mindset, because after that, I hiked alone for the next 5 or 6 days. In the end, again, it all turned out good. And in those circumstances, I knew that no matter what, it's an agreement. Stu said, go ahead. Stu was going back. And I knew there was guys on the trail, lots of people, because we're on Molar Pass heading towards Fish Lake. I knew there's people behind. I knew there was people. I knew no matter what, that if I wasn't there for Stu and something else happened to him, he would have encountered somebody else. So don't judge. It's based on years of experience, information at the time, and other factors. So me and Wally, we put that to rest. Nobody criticized Wally. No wonder there's good fishing in the rivers and lakes. Oh yeah, well, there's great fishing because nobody goes there. Jacqueline, yes, self-sufficient is so important and comforting. Distracted Tin Basher, a lot of lakes and rivers in the national parks are closed to fishing as to allow the fish population to recover. Yeah, there's a couple. One that comes to mind is, not just in the national park. I mean, there's several. One thing about Alberta is that I think somebody once told me there's like under 500 lakes that are fishable. So we have 4 million people and 500 lakes, but about 500,000 people like to fish. So it's like 1,000 person per lake, and so the lakes could technically get crowded with a lot of fishing. Whereas you got a province like Ontario or Manitoba, I think Ontario's got 12 million lakes and a population of 12 million people. So in theory, it's like one person per lake. So our ratios are brutal, and our lakes take a beating. Now in that part of the world, it's mostly brook trout and rainbow trouts and things like that. Maligne Lake's got some good fishing. Actually, when I came out on Maligne Lake, there were lots of boats on the water fishing. Interesting fact, further south on the Great Divide Trail, just in that same area in Section E, when you're hiking over Owen Creek and you end up at Michelle Lake and 2 other lakes, so 3 lakes in Alberta have golden trout. And golden trout is not native to Alberta lakes, but golden trout was introduced, I believe, from Colorado in about the 1940s and 50s, and did very well in 3 lakes. They're little tarn lakes up in the mountains that are alkali and quite suited. And apparently the population of golden trout in Michelle Lake is very healthy, and you can get some fair-sized golden trout out of that lake. All right, folks, it's been 40 minutes of talking. I'll if somebody's got a couple of questions, please ask a couple of questions. Stephen Bouchard. Stephen, hey, thanks for sharing, Marty. Great live stream. Yeah, Stephen, thanks, Stephen. For those who don't know, Stephen joined me on a couple of hikes. He's He moved here from Ontario, reached out, which again I say to people, I used to do my contest hikes, but reach out to me on social media and other things, and don't be shy. Sort of muscle your way in if you want to come hiking with me. Stephen did just that. He came in the winter. We had a fantastic hike, and I made a joke. Him and I went back to Carnarvon Lake together. So I laughed. I'm like, well, you obviously made the cut because I re-invited you for a second time. So yes, Stephen, you made the cut. And glad that you're joining my circle of friends and coming on hikes. Bushfires. What do you mean exactly by bushfires? I mean, I make fires all the time. Yeah, Jackie, take a rod to Michelle Lake. Absolutely. Thank you, Marty. Great hearing your voice again. I'm out west again with Wally in the fall. If you are around, would be great to see you. Absolutely. Yeah, Wally's out right now. He's in the Tom Quinn. So Wally sent me an email. I'm Wally's designated rescue party, and keep that in mind, folks. I've talked about this on other videos. People have the Zolios or the SOS spots or the Garmins, but they've never really planned, and there's an emergency and they hit the button and they don't know what happens next. That's not enough. So no matter what, have a plan. Let somebody know where you're going. So Wally's hiking in the Tom Quinn. It's a pretty popular area. But at least I know where he is. I know his itinerary. And if there's an SOS and somehow or other they contact me, I'll know where he is and I can help people get to him quickly. I heard sorry. Okay, I see your question there, Yellow Boy. No, the forest fires in Alberta are totally subsided now. It was an interesting, weird start to the season. It's common to have forest fires in believe it or not, in April and May when the snows are first melting. But you heard me comment in this video. It's not in the mountains. The Canadian Rockies themselves are soaking wet right now. Soaking wet right now. Do you think there will be a time again that Parks Canada will put money back into trails, i.e. infrastructure? That's the topic for a whole other video someday. My short answer to that is no. I think we are kind of done like I said, the third big era of backpacking, and Parks Canada right now makes no money with spending on infrastructure. No, it's the short answer is no, but it's a great question, and I'll talk about that in an upcoming video because it's a question I get asked a lot. Now, to be honest, Marty himself is kind of okay with the government not putting a lot of money back into infrastructure because, maybe it's a little selfish. I'm not afraid to go and cross and ford rivers, and I'm not afraid to go somewhere where there's no bear pole or no toilet and stuff like that. And I find that too much of that infrastructure encourages too many people. So I think that's why Parks Canada is pulling back to kind of discourage some people from going in some of these trails. So I'm kind of okay on that. Is Quartzsite Call a doable hike from Mosquito Creek? How hard is the scrambling? I'm backpacking it in the area and wondering how difficult it is. Caleb, all I can say is go look at my video entitled maybe I'll try and find your comment after this, but the contest hike of 2 years ago, I took the whole group over the Quartzsite Call. So we started at Mosquito. We went over Quartzsite as a shortcut into the Clearwater Pass and Devon Lakes. And it's a fantastic shortcut. You need to know sort of where it is. It's not entirely obvious once you're higher up going over the call. It's not for the faint of heart. There's a bit of scrambling up and down, and it can be very snowbound very late. But it's a fantastic destination, and I would encourage you to look up that video of the contest hike, or just Google the word Quartzsite and Martyupnorth, and you'll see some of my hikes up that area. Do your kids still go with you? No, my kids are 29, 23, 22, and 18, and they're doing their own thing with their own girlfriends. But they love hiking, and they do it with their friends instead of doing it with me. Yeah, the whole liability God, you guys are asking some great questions. Yeah, I want to talk about, okay, it's the topic for another video, but yeah, when an institution like Parks Canada charges an entry fee and a backcountry fee, two things happen. One, no matter what, when you charge a fee, the park becomes liable. So that's a fact. And the other thing is when they charge a fee, people expect something for their fee. So, for instance, even down in Kananaskis a couple of years ago, when the government said we're going to charge a fee and the fee is going to go towards educating people, nah, not in people's minds. In people's minds, they paid a fee and they'll decide what they think they paid the fee for. So the government can say it's for an education campaign, but an individual will go, no, it's for garbage disposal and for a fire pit. So immediately we saw that in Kananaskis. Now that people are paying a fee, they're expecting something more, and it kind of backfires. And back to the point one, if the government's liable, then and people are expecting, then the government has to put in more safeguards and more services. So as an example, I used to go, when I bought the sandwich in the video and I went to Sunwapta. If you go to Sunwapta Falls, when I was a kid and we go to Sunwapta Falls, I could like literally walk over to the falls and fall in and no big deal. There was no fences. There was no paved walkway to it. There was no parking lot. There was nothing. But now that the government charges and is liable and has to de facto provide a service, it's paved. There's a chain link fence. There's a bathroom there. There's warning signs everywhere. And the government has to protect you from yourself when you go visit something like that. And then as that infrastructure gets older, it has to be renewed and recycled and fixed and repaired. And it's a vicious cycle. So it's a problem. It's a vicious cycle to charge for access to the backcountry. Don't ever wish the government gets involved with the crown land areas. You will lose everything that is good about it. Yeah, it's another interesting topic. Yeah, governments can't do anything well. You guys are after my own heart here. Listen, folks, it's been a fantastic. I hope you enjoyed this, and thumbs up if you want me to do more of these. It's kind of weird talking to yourself for 45 minutes to an hour, but I'm happy to do these. They're fun. Maybe I'll try and do one sort of after every video if there's something interesting that comes out of the video. Maligne Lake was part two of an adventure last weekend. The first part was when I went up the Coral Creek with JT and Jeff. I'm working on editing that video. I think you'll find that one fascinating. Coral Creek is gorgeous. Again, it's an area that's seldom discovered. It goes hand in hand with the fact that I just did a map review of the White Goat Wilderness. Coral Creek is a creek that discourages people because it has to be forded so many times. And you'll see in the video, just in one day, we had to ford it like a dozen times, and they're not easy fords. We gave up on going further north on Coral Creek, and then we came back, and then we did something interesting. We went on the north shore of the Cline River. So everybody goes on the south shore where they go to Entry Creek, and they use the south shore to go to Pinto Lake. We did a hike on the north shore just again to go see what shape that looks like. I'm going to be playing in the Ghost or the White Goat and the Job Creek. I got a 10-day hike in August planned in that part of the world. So that's this year's big hike is up towards Job Lake and try to intersect the Brazeau. Anyways, folks, thanks for joining me. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your fantastic questions. Please, don't just give me questions here. Send me question. If you send me a question on any of my videos, I think I answer 95 to 99% of the questions. If you ask me a question that needs a complex answer, I'll share my email. I mean, I just don't put it all out there, but I'm not afraid of sharing my email with people so that they can ask questions, so that they can continue to discover the sport, because that's what I want. I'm passionate about the sport. I'm passionate about Alberta. I'm passionate about the Rockies, and I just want people to get out there. I do have a few requests. Like I said, I tell people a common request that I have is please, please, please don't try to transform the backcountry experience into a front country experience. Let's try and keep that backcountry wild. I know you love I know many of you love the bear poles and the green thrones and the bear lockers and the bridges and stuff like that, but it's getting to be a little too much on some trails. And so let's keep it wild. Let's not forget that we go out there we don't need to, we want to experience something different than the front country. Anyways, friends, I love you all. Thank you so much. And I'm going to sign off now. And please keep those comments coming my way. So Martyupnorth saying, everybody cheers and get off that beaten path. Good night, folks.